When I first bought the land by the lake, it was nothing but quiet water and trees. No crowds, no noise, just the sound of birds and the soft splash of fish breaking the surface. It was my place of peace, my retreat from the busy world. For years I kept it simple and natural, building only a small cabin and a wooden dock for myself. Then the HOA came. They bought the land around the lake and started building houses one after another. 35 homes went up in less than 2 years. The sound of saws and hammers replaced the birdsong, and the smell of fresh pine was drowned out by concrete and asphalt. They called it progress, but to me it was theft. The HOA decided that my lakefront cabin was part of their new community. They sent me letters telling me I had to join their association and follow their rules. I laughed at first and tossed the letters into the fire. But then they got bold. One morning I walked outside and found survey stakes in my yard. The HOA president Karen stood there with a clipboard, smiling like she owned the place. She told me my dock was now community property and that I could not use the lake without HOA approval. I told her I owned this land long before they came. She smirked and said that did not matter anymore. That was when I knew they had made their biggest mistake. Because I had something they did not know about. At the far end of the lake, hidden behind thick brush, there was a dam built decades ago. It was small but strong, with a simple steel gate and a valve. When closed, it kept the lake full and wide. When opened, it drained the water back into the old riverbed it once was. My grandfather built that dam when he owned the land, and he left me the key. No one in the HOA even knew it existed. For weeks I watched them hold parties on the water. They tied their boats to my dock without asking. They strutted around calling it their lakefront community. And every time I saw them, I felt the key to the dam grow heavier in my pocket. One night, I walked down the old trail to the dam. The moonlight shimmered off the surface of the water, and the frogs croaked in the reeds. I stood there staring at the steel gate with my hand on the key. I thought about what my grandfather told me once. The land does not belong to people, people belong to the land. I turned the key slowly. The old valve groaned as I cranked it open. At first nothing happened, just a low rumble deep below the water. Then the current began to move. The water swirled and rushed toward the opening, flowing faster and faster. The lake began to sink. By morning, the wide, calm water had turned into a shallow, muddy basin. Fish darted in the trickle of the old river, and the birds returned to feast. The boats the HOA left tied to my dock lay stranded in the mud. Children stood on the shore confused while their parents argued about what had happened. Karen stormed up to my porch, red-faced and furious. She demanded to know if I had anything to do with it. I leaned against the railing, calm as the sunrise, and simply said, "Nature has a way of taking back what is hers." She stared at me, speechless. The HOA scrambled to find someone to blame, but there was nothing they could do. The houses they had built so close to the water were now looking out over mud and reeds instead of a sparkling lake. Their dream community had turned into an eyesore overnight. And I stood there smiling because I knew one thing. I had only just begun. The days that followed were chaos for the HOA. Residents gathered on the cracked shore, angry and shouting at each other. Some demanded that Karen fix the problem, while others whispered that maybe I had something to do with it. Karen marched around with her clipboard, pretending to be in control, but her voice shook and her hands trembled. I sat on my porch sipping coffee, watching them panic as the water level continued to drop each day. Boats were abandoned in the mud, their bright paint now dull and cracked under the sun. Lawns that had once touched the water were now dry, cracked dirt full of weeds. Wildlife started to move back, and ducks nested in the reeds that had sprung up overnight, and deer came down to drink from the narrow stream that now ran through the valley. It was almost like the lake had never been there at all. One evening, Karen knocked on my door without her usual smug grin. She looked tired, desperate. She told me the homeowners were furious and property values were crashing. She accused me again of draining the lake and demanded I fix it. I leaned against the doorframe and told her she had built her houses on something she never owned. The land was mine, the water was mine, and they were only guests who had overstayed their welcome. Her face went pale, but she tried to hold her ground. She said the HOA would sue me. I chuckled and told her lawsuits mean nothing to the river. Nature always wins. She had no answer to that. By the next week, realtors had started showing up trying to sell the half-finished houses. No one wanted to buy them, not with the stench of drying mud and rotting boats filling the air. Karen still strutted around pretending everything was fine, but her voice no longer carried power. And every night when the moon rose, I walked back down the trail to the dam. I tightened the valve just enough to keep the river flowing steady, watching the land return to what it once was. The silence, the birds, the running water. It was all coming back to life. And for the first time in years, I felt peace knowing the lake was mine again, and that the HOA had learned a lesson they would never forget. The following weekend, more families started moving out. Their once bright houses now looked abandoned, shutters rattling in the wind, paint peeling from the damp air, and mud that clung to the driveways. Karen was the only one still clinging to the dream, walking around with her papers and rules, as if the community was still alive. But every time she passed my porch, she avoided my eyes. One afternoon, I saw her standing by the old lake bed staring at the cracked earth. She looked smaller. Somehow the confidence that used to radiate from her was gone, replaced with worry. Children no longer played in the streets. There were no more barbecues or boats, no more laughter, only silence. Nature was swallowing everything back. The weeds were taller each day, and the sound of frogs croaking in the evening had returned. The river carved its way deeper, and the fish moved freely again where fences had once stood. Karen came to me again, this time without her clipboard. Her voice was softer, almost pleading. She said the homeowners were leaving one by one, and she begged me to at least restore part of the lake, so she could save face. I shook my head and told her that sometimes you cannot force the world to bend to your plans. She had tried to control everything, and now she was watching it slip through her fingers. She turned and walked away slowly, shoulders slumped, as if carrying the weight of the entire failed neighborhood. That night, the stars reflected in the little stream running where the lake had been. It was quiet, peaceful, and I knew the land was finally free from the grip of the HOA. Weeks passed, and the neighborhood that once buzzed with artificial perfection now felt like a ghost town. Driveways stood empty, grass grew wild, and fences leaned as if tired of standing guard. The air was fresher without the constant noise of boats and leaf blowers, and at night the crickets sang so loudly it felt like nature itself was celebrating. Karen still tried to hold meetings in the clubhouse, but no one came. The polished wood floor echoed under her shoes as she sat alone with her papers stacked neatly in front of her. One afternoon, I saw her by the waterline again. This time, she had no clipboard, no stack of rules. She just stood there watching the stream ripple, as if hoping it would rise back to the lake it once was. She finally spoke quietly, saying she had only wanted to create a community, something people would be proud of. I told her that pride had turned to greed and control, and that sometimes what people need most is space to breathe. Karen looked down, her voice shaky, as she admitted she had not seen it that way until now. The weeds swayed in the wind, the river hummed softly, and it felt like the land itself was teaching her a lesson. But whether she truly learned it or not was another matter entirely. Days grew shorter, and the chill of autumn crept in. The once uniform lawns that Karen had demanded to be trimmed to perfection were now blanketed in leaves, red, orange, and gold, nature painting over her rules without asking permission. Karen wandered the streets less often, though every so often I would see her lingering near the old lake bed, her shoes sinking into the soft soil where water used to rest. She looked older somehow, as if the weight of everything she had tried to control had finally begun to press down on her. One evening, as the sun dipped low, she came to my porch for the first time without anger or accusation in her eyes. She sat on the steps without asking, and for a long time, she said nothing, just listened to the sound of the river flowing steadily beyond the trees. Finally, she asked me if I thought the water would ever return, if the land would ever forgive what had been forced upon it. I told her nature does not forget, but it always finds a way to heal. She nodded slowly, as if holding on to those words like a lifeline, her gaze drifting out toward the horizon where the last of the daylight faded behind the hills. The silence between us was heavy yet peaceful, as if even she knew deep down that the fight she had waged was over and the land had won. Winter arrived, and the land transformed once more. Snow fell thick over the abandoned houses, covering their cracked driveways and peeling shutters in a blanket of white. The silence, even deeper than before. The old lake bed froze over, not with water, but with layers of frost that glittered under the pale moonlight like shards of glass scattered across the earth. Karen walked slower these days, her once sharp stride replaced with the shuffle of someone who had lost more than she cared to admit. I watched her one morning standing near the edge of the frozen ground, bundled in a heavy coat, staring at the emptiness, as if she could will the lake back with her eyes. She turned toward me, her breath misting in the cold air, and said that everything felt hollow now, the houses, the streets, even her own home. I reminded her gently that hollowness was what came when you tried to control what was never meant to be owned. Karen frowned, but there was no fire behind her expression, only the quiet resignation of someone who finally saw the truth. The wind howled through the bare trees, and in that moment it felt like the land itself was whispering its victory, carrying away the last remnants of her fight. But still she lingered, as though waiting for something, waiting for a sign that the world she had built could be restored, though deep down she knew it never would. When spring finally came, the snow melted into rivulets that wound their way down to the stream. The ground softened and green shoots pushed through the soil, eager to reclaim what had once been theirs. Birdsong filled the air, louder than the engines and lawnmowers that used to dominate the mornings. Karen still walked the edges of the land, but she was quieter now, her clipboard gone, her posture no longer stiff with authority. One morning I saw her kneeling by the stream. She dipped her hand into the cool water, letting it run between her fingers as though she were touching something she had not known in years. When she stood, her eyes were glassy. She looked up at me across the distance, and there was no demand in her gaze, only something closer to acceptance. She said softly that maybe the lake was never meant to be framed by fences and rules, maybe it was meant to flow wild and free. I did not answer, only watched as the wind lifted her hair and the water sparkled in the sun. The community she tried to shape was gone, but the land was alive again, breathing louder each day. And though Karen still lingered on its edges, it was clear she was no longer its master. Weeks passed, and the once carefully trimmed lawns grew into meadows buzzing with bees and butterflies. Wildflowers painted the hillsides with colors that no landscaper could ever match, and the sound of frogs at night became a chorus that wrapped the cabins in song. Children who used to stay indoors glued to screens now chased fireflies barefoot through the tall grass, laughing until the stars filled the sky. I would sometimes sit by the water, watching the reflection of the moon ripple across the surface, feeling a peace I had not known since before the HOA arrived. Karen still came by now and then, but instead of barking orders, she simply walked slowly along the shore, her eyes tracing the flow of the current, as if searching for something she had lost. One evening she stopped near where I was stacking driftwood and said that she had started dreaming of the lake the way it used to be, before the houses, before the endless meetings, before the rules. Her voice cracked slightly as she admitted she could not remember the last time she felt the ground beneath her bare feet. I said nothing, only handed her a piece of driftwood for the fire, and she surprised me by taking off her shoes and stepping onto the cool earth. The flames rose, and the night wrapped around us with the quiet strength of the wilderness taking back its claim inch by inch. The fire crackled, and sparks lifted into the dark sky like tiny stars carried upward by the wind. Karen sat down on a log across from me, staring into the flames with a look that was softer than I had ever seen on her face. For the first time, she did not look like the woman who marched around with clipboards and threats. She looked like someone remembering who she once was. The silence between us was not heavy, it was almost healing, the kind of quiet that only the woods could give. She told me how she used to camp by a river with her grandfather, and how she had loved the sound of the water against the rocks, how it had made her feel small but safe. I listened without interrupting, letting her words flow like the current she was describing. When the fire burned low, I poured water over the embers and watched the smoke curl into the night sky. Karen stood with me, her bare feet brushing the earth, and for a moment, she did not look like someone out of place. She looked like she belonged. The lake shimmered under the moonlight, and in that moment, I realized nature had not only taken back the land, it was slowly taking back parts of us too. Karen stood quietly at the edge of the water, her reflection rippling in the silver glow of the moon. She knelt down and let her fingers graze the surface, sending small waves out into the stillness. Her eyes softened as she watched the ripples fade away as though the lake itself was answering her thoughts. I walked closer, and the cool air carried the scent of pine and damp earth, reminding me that the land was alive and breathing. Karen whispered that maybe the lake had always belonged to the earth and not to papers and rules and claims. Her words surprised me, but they carried a truth that I had always felt deep inside. The frogs croaked and the crickets sang, filling the night with their steady rhythm. Karen stood up again, brushing the dirt from her hands, and looked at me with a quiet understanding that had never been there before. The woods seemed to lean in around us, as if listening, as if they too were waiting to see what would happen next. Karen stood quietly at the edge of the water, her reflection rippling in the silver glow of the moon. She knelt down and let her fingers graze the surface, sending small waves out into the stillness. Her eyes softened as she watched the ripples fade away as though the lake itself was answering her thoughts. I walked closer, and the cool air carried the scent of pine and damp earth, reminding me that the land was alive and breathing. Karen whispered that maybe the lake had always belonged to the earth and not to papers and rules and claims. Her words surprised me, but they carried a truth that I had always felt deep inside. The frogs croaked and the crickets sang, filling the night with their steady rhythm. Karen stood up again, brushing the dirt from her hands, and looked at me with a quiet understanding that had never been there before. The woods seemed to lean in around us, as if listening, as if they too were waiting to see what would happen next. I met her gaze, and for a long moment neither of us spoke. The silence was heavy, yet gentle, like the calm before a storm. The water lapped softly against the shore, almost like a heartbeat, steady and patient, as if urging us to listen. Karen finally said that she had fought so hard to control the lake because she feared losing what little she thought was hers. Her voice cracked, and I could see the weight she carried behind her sharp words and stubborn stance. I told her that the lake was never meant to be owned or caged, that it was a gift meant to be shared by those who respected it. The trees swayed gently in the night breeze, as if agreeing with me, their shadows long and reaching across the ground. Karen sighed, and her shoulders sagged as though the fight had drained out of her, leaving only the woman beneath. She asked me if there was a way to make peace with the land, to let it be free again and still find a place for herself in it. The night grew quieter, then the stars brighter above us, like silent witnesses to a promise waiting to be made. I felt the ground steady beneath my feet and knew the answer would not come from rules or power, but from listening to the earth itself. Karen waited, her eyes wide and searching, as if she was seeing me and the lake for the very first time. I told her the land would guide her if she let it, that the water would speak if she learned to hear, and that the trees would shelter her if she treated them with care. Karen looked out over the lake, her reflection trembling on the surface, as if the water was testing her resolve. She whispered that she had been wrong, that fences and gates could not protect her, that they had only locked her away from what she truly needed. For the first time her voice was soft, not sharp, and her words carried more honesty than anger. The moon broke through a patch of clouds, silver light spilling across the lake like a blessing. I told her she could start again, not as the one who ruled the lake, but as the one who helped care for it. Karen turned to me, her eyes glistening with a strange mix of regret and hope, as though she stood on the edge of something new. The wind picked up and carried the scent of pine and damp earth, reminding us both that we were standing in the arms of nature itself. She asked me what it would take for the lake to forgive her, and her voice trembled like a child seeking comfort. The water rippled as if it too was listening, waiting for her to take the first step toward change. I told her forgiveness was not mine to give, that it had to be earned with every step she took and every choice she made from this moment forward. Karen looked back at the cabins, the empty homes that had once been filled with noise and pride, now standing like hollow shells against the night. She wrapped her arms around herself, and for once her posture was not one of defiance, but of surrender. The lake shimmered faintly under the moonlight, and a heron lifted from the reeds, its wings spreading wide, as it glided into the silence. I told her that maybe the lake had already started forgiving her, because it was still here, still breathing, still alive, despite everything she had tried to take from it. Karen closed her eyes, as if those words weighed heavy, but also lifted something off her shoulders. When she opened them, there was no fire, no argument, only a quiet determination that had never been there before. The breeze shifted, and the surface of the water seemed to nod as though answering the question she had whispered to it moments earlier. Karen stepped closer to the edge of the lake, her reflection trembling again, but steadier this time, as though the water was willing to give her another chance. I stayed silent, watching her face, as she reached out her hand, letting her fingertips skim the surface, like a promise waiting to be kept. The ripples spread outward, soft and slow, as if the lake itself had accepted her touch. Karen stared at the water, her shoulders shaking, but no words came out, only a silence that spoke louder than anything she could have said. I stood a few steps back, letting her have that moment, because I knew it was not mine to share or to take away. The night was calm, the stars scattered above us, and the crickets filled the air with their steady song. Karen stayed at the edge of the water, tracing circles with her fingertips, as though she was trying to rewrite everything she had done. Finally, she whispered that she did not know how to fix what was broken, but she wanted to try. I told her that the lake did not need perfection, it only needed respect and patience. Her eyes lifted to me, glistening with the reflection of the moon, and she nodded slowly. It was the first time since I had met her that she looked less like an enemy and more like someone who might learn to belong here. Behind us, the cabins stood still, their shadows stretching into the woods, as if waiting to see what would come next. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of pine and water, and for the first time in a long while the place felt at peace. Karen stayed by the water a long time, her hand resting on the surface, as if the lake itself could answer her. The moonlight softened her face, and for once the sharpness in her expression seemed to fade, replaced with something quieter, almost fragile. I watched her breathe deep, as though she was pulling in the strength to let go of old battles she had been fighting for too long. She stood slowly, brushing her hands against her dress, and turned toward me. Her voice was softer than I had ever heard when she asked if she could walk the shore with me just for a while. I agreed, and together we followed the curve of the lake, the gravel crunching under our steps and the water lapping gently beside us. She spoke about how rules had always given her a sense of control, but how she realized control had blinded her to the life around her. I listened, not interrupting, because it felt like the first time she was truly letting the walls fall. The trees whispered overhead, swaying with the night air, and the stars mirrored on the water like tiny lanterns guiding us forward. Karen looked at them and said, "Maybe the lake was never meant to be owned, maybe it was meant to be shared." Her words lingered between us like a promise not yet made, but ready to take form. I walked beside Karen as her steps grew slower, her eyes tracing the shimmering reflections that danced on the water. She admitted she had never truly seen the lake at night, always too busy sending letters or calling meetings to notice its calm beauty. I could hear a tremor in her voice when she said she thought she had been protecting the community, but in truth she had been closing herself off from it. The night carried her words like a confession, and the silence that followed was filled with the sound of crickets and the distant hoot of an owl. Karen stopped by a large flat rock and sat down, her shoulders hunched, as if she carried years of weight. I joined her, and for a while we said nothing, only watching the slow ripples stretching out across the lake. Then she asked if I thought the others would forgive her, if she tried to change, if she let go of the need to control everything. The question hung in the air, fragile and uncertain, like a single leaf trembling on a branch. I told her that forgiveness begins with honesty, and that people see more than we think they do. They notice when someone is trying. Her eyes grew glassy as she whispered that maybe it was time she tried living, not just enforcing. The breeze shifted and carried the scent of pine and damp earth, and for the first time her face looked free of the rigid mask she always wore. Karen leaned back on the rock, tilting her head to the sky, where stars shimmered like scattered diamonds. She said she had not looked at the stars in years. She had been too wrapped up in rules and property lines to notice how wide the world really was. Her voice was softer now, stripped of the sharpness it usually carried, as though the night had smoothed its edges. I told her the lake had a way of reminding people of what truly mattered. It never asked for permission to flow, it simply existed, and in that it found its strength. Karen let out a laugh, faint and broken but real, and she admitted she envied that freedom. She said that all her life she had wanted to be in control because Losing control had once cost her more than she cared to share. For a long moment we sat in the quiet until she finally said maybe it was time she learned how to let go and trust that not everything needed to be fought or managed. The moonlight touched her face, and I could see something shift in her expression, as though she had discovered a part of herself that had been buried for years. When she stood again, her steps were slower but steadier, and she looked at the water as if it were a teacher showing her a truth she had long forgotten. The night carried her words away, but the silence left behind seemed different now, filled with the possibility of change. Karen turned back one last time before walking up the trail. Her shoulders no longer hunched with the weight of authority, but seemed lighter, as if she had set something down by the lakeside. She gave me a nod, one of quiet respect, and said she hoped to see me again, though not as an enforcer of rules, but simply as a neighbor. I smiled and told her the lake had space enough for everyone, even those who had once tried to claim it with lines and papers. As she disappeared into the trees, the sound of the water filled the night, carrying a piece that had been missing for far too long. The lake belonged to no one and to everyone, and in that truth even Karen finally found her place. The stars shimmered above the water, and I knew the battle was over, not with shouting or anger, but with the quiet power of letting nature speak for itself. And in that stillness the lake was whole again, and so were we.